I am so happy that there's a lot of people here after constant rescheduling and, you know, the constant snow day mayhem that we've been dealing. This is the third time. I'm glad you all could come out. I'm glad our speakers could be here, obviously. My name is Christian Novi. I'm president of the Political Science Club. And just to give a little plug for the club, we meet every Wednesday at 7:30 in Ruby Jones 104. Come out. All viewpoints are welcome, other than fascists, obviously. That seems to be the lame line I do every time. The way it's going to go, we're having a debate on capitalism versus Marxism. The format's going to be a little bit different from our last debates. All of the speakers have been informed about this. First, we'll start with a brief opening statement, giving the positions of each one, since there are variations of both theories, of course. Then I will ask from a list of questions. After 2 questions or so, I'll ask the audience for questions. Now, when I ask the audience for questions, we're not trying to have a lot of opinionated rants or anything like that. Try to keep it constrained to a question, and try not to just have a little bickering fight with the audience members. There will be rebuttals unless, you know, the speaker asks you a question to you. Also, when you ask questions, address it to either both teams or one team. That seems to be an easy way of managing this. Other than that, I'll continue down the list if there's no questions, or, you know, after a couple questions, I want to keep the ball rolling. Other than that, we'll keep the pattern up until, and then probably a little brief closing statement to close it all off at the end. But that's basically the basic debate format. Without any further ado, I'd like to start off with some opening statements with Team Marxism. Oh, first introduce yourselves. That would have been more important. Give a little bio about yourself, you know, what you're doing here at the school, and your position.
We just go around.
Yeah, just start from over here.
My name is John Leveley. I'm a professor in sociology in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology here at Westchester University. I have several areas of specialization. My primary area of specialization is sociological theory, social theory, hence Marxism, right? My earlier research was on the history of psychiatry, and my dissertation was on the history of psychiatry. In the last 2 or 3 years, I shifted my research focus to social movements, protest movements, okay? And more political sociology, if you will. And so that's what I'm doing now.
I'm Nick Giorgio, history major, minor in political science and Latin American Latino studies. Senior. What else would you like to know? That's fine.
Hello, comrades.
You're on the wrong side.
I'm wrong side. My name is Tom Mandrakia. I am a junior history and secondary education major. I am the president of Students for Liberty, and I would like to thank everyone for coming, my debate partners here, and the Political Science Club for organizing this.
Chris Stagel, I teach in the Department of Political Science. I teach constitutional law, political theory. Dr. Leveley, we have our theory backgrounds here. First Amendment law, and as far as theory goes, I can't say I have a specific area of interest, but PhD was on pragmatism in the early 20th century, so that tends to upset both sides of the argument here, but we'll let that slide for the time being.
Okay, that being said, I'd like to start off with some opening statements. We'll start with Team Marxism.
Yep. Okay. Considering that I only have 5 minutes, I'm not quite sure what to say here, because as some people know, I've been talking for a long time, right? So let me start. I should probably start by saying, I should raise my hand probably and say I am not now, nor have I ever been, a member of the Communist Party. So any FBI agents out there? I say that in jest, and I'm not a communist, right? I am a Marxist of sorts, right? I'm not an orthodox Marxist. I'm a Marxist, right? I certainly don't want a totalitarian state like the Soviet Union or North Korea or anything like that, okay? But I subscribe to the essential core ideas of Marxism. So I'll start with that. Particularly the idea of Marx's methodology of dialectical materialism. I think this is the proper way of understanding the problems of capitalism and suggestions about the future. Okay? A few other comments. You know, Marxism could be, really, the way I look at Marxism, can be summarized in terms of that catchy little pithy, empty slogan, people before profits. Right? And I don't need to go into that right now, but capitalism is profits before people. Right? And Marxism really is a theoretical explanation for the other way around. Okay? Another comment, I guess I have several little comments I can make and then I can pass it on. Another comment I want to make is about fantasy, or utopia, right? The common criticism of Marxism is that utopia, Marx is a utopian, right? And of course, Marx specifically addresses that point, right? And he says he's not. Whether we can go along with his criticisms or arguments along that line is a question. But I just think that fantasy is something that we need to consider not simply in terms of Marxism, but in terms of capitalism. Do we live in a capitalist society? What does that mean, right? Or should we live in a capitalist society? What does that mean, right? So I think the fantasy argument plays on both sides of the coin. Okay? Another thing is, Christian framed the debate, he framed it Marxism versus capitalism, and I took exception to that in the sense that capitalism is an economic system, Marxism is a political economic philosophy, right? And unless we understand the society in terms of political economy rather than simply economy, right? I think we're going to miss the boat, at least on our side. We're going to miss the boat on understanding the full, rich understanding of Marx. Okay?
Marxism is, I'm sorry.
One other thing, the last thing I want to mention is just state is the idea of the state, and this relates to the idea of utopia, fantasy, and that kind of stuff. Marx's vision of the state, right? People sometimes think of Marx's vision of the state as being totalitarian, and/or if not, at the end of the game, at the end of the road, totalitarian, like North Korea or the Soviet Union. I certainly wouldn't want to live in either of those places, right? Who would, right? But the question is, what is Marx's vision of the state, right? And I would suggest that it's more akin to anarchy than it is to totalitarianism, right? Now we could talk about whether this is plausible in Marx's writings or not. So I'll just leave it there.
To use a quote from Anton Pannekoek, the political state throughout history has meant the government of men by ruling classes. The Republic of Socialism will be the government of industry administered on behalf of the whole community. As he said in the beginning, people over profits. Didn't want to mess that up. Basically everything you read or you've heard about Stalinism, for example, being the epitome of communism and all of that coming down on Christmas Day 1991, et cetera, et cetera. It's just, those notions are indefensible. What we are defending is the Marxist outlook on the human condition in particular, as well as economies and history through a dialectical materialist lens.
Okay, so lots of different definitions you can give to capitalism. We are not defending mercantilist capitalism, which included colonialism or the slave trade or anything like that. We're going to defend what is precisely called mostly free market capitalism. So what I mean by that, we're not going full anarchist approach, much to the dismay of my friends over here. But we're going for a limited government ideal in the marketplace. Definition of capitalism. It's simply an economic system in which the means of production and property are privately owned. There's not much else to it. A free market would be a system in which prices are determined by unrestricted trade between private firms. A system in which transactions are voluntary. So you're going to have voluntary trade, privately owned property. So that's what we're going to mean when we say capitalism, right? The best thing about our position is even if you don't go with the limited government approach, even if you believe in more intervention in the government, even in the economy by the government, even if you support socialist democracies in Europe, you're still a capitalist. Those countries in Europe tend to have very free economies, even more free in some cases than the US. So don't think that if your ideal is universal healthcare, that you're automatically on the Marxist side. So Karl Marx didn't simply just want more welfare programs within a capitalist system. He wanted to move past that capitalist system. In the Communist Manifesto, he called for total government control of land, factories, credit, communication, and so on. He said capitalism was inherently an exploitative system. He saw the rich capitalists becoming rich at the expense of everyone else. Marx was wrong, and we are going to try to prove that in this debate using empirical data, theory, and so on. Free market capitalism simply has a track record of lifting millions of people, billions of people out of poverty. And that's what we're going to go on today.
All right, I'll start off with the first question. This may seem like it's just for one side, but since Marx has been a critic of capitalism since we started writing, we'll start over at the Marxist side, but I'll let you answer the exact same question. The way we do rebuttals here is that if you ask me to rebuttal, say, a statement on one side or the other, you just got to ask, and given time, I'll grant it. But other than that, I try not to yell too much. The first question I wanted to ask, was Marx right about class struggle, class conflict? It seems to be a main theme in a lot of his writings, so I wanted to ask the Marxists first.
Absolutely, and we see it today almost as much as we've seen it throughout history. When you have a small group of people here owning 8 times as much, 100 times as much as those who are doing less off, while the less off in countries other than the US that have been exploited can't feed themselves, and then you come back to the United States and there are people here who cannot feed themselves or their children. And we're seeing movements, social movements like the Occupy movement, other movements, where people are finally starting to realize that yes, class struggle does exist. And something has to be done, not just, we don't need more welfare, we don't need more social programs, etc. We need to look critically at the system itself.
Can I piggyback on that?
Yeah, we should.
I would take a slightly different view about that, even though we're on the same page. If you talk about class struggle in the time Marx was writing, he was writing in the time of industrialization, right? We live in a post-industrial society, right? How many people are working in factories today, right? 3, 4, right? But does that mean that factories don't exist? I mean, the factories in America have gone, right? Factories in the world have not gone. There are more factories in the world today than there have been any time, right? So the industrial argument about that Marx was based upon, it's still applicable, right? Class conflict in terms of the industrial labor versus capital, if you will, right? It's still applicable, ironically, in China, right? It's supposed to be a communist country, right? In industrializing countries, right? The essential contradictions in in post-industrial capitalism, I would argue, is not class conflict. There are essential contradictions in the capitalist system, in capitalism, but it's not rooted in, it's not coalescing. Marx thought that it was going to coalesce between labor and capital in the form of unions versus owners, right? In capitalism in the United States, the working class, the industrial working class, has been eviscerated, right? And so the conflict, I think, in capitalism in the United States is fundamentally different than the conflict in capitalism in industrialized countries. In the United States, it's a conflict between values, human values, and instrumental values, right? And that they appear and manifest themselves in other ways besides class conflict, but they're still there.
Okay, to the original question, was he right about class struggle? I think absolutely yes. I think that's quite obvious, as with the Occupy Wall Street movement, things like that. It wasn't a particularly original idea, as by his own admission, he didn't think of it. It was a pretty old idea, but I think he was right about it. I don't think that means there's inherent contradictions in capitalism or anything like that. And I think, he predicted that these bourgeois, factory owners were going to drive wages down to the point where his workers couldn't even buy their own products, and this class struggle would just become worse and worse and worse, and he was dead wrong about that. What we see is that we had people that were very, very poor before any kind of industrialization started. They worked on farms very long hours a day, including children. Child labor was not invented with capitalism. And then factories came along and they still had very, very hard lives, and then their lives continued to get better in that capitalist system. And that's why we're not working on farms right now. We're in a university.
Public university.
Yeah, I would agree with Tom that Marx was largely right in some of the diagnoses. As far as prescriptions for the future, I agree with folks on the other side that we're going to have to reframe Marx's critique to fully encompass whatever challenges we're facing now. I think a division between human and instrumental values makes sense. I would, from a capitalist perspective, hasten to add that not all instrumental values are necessarily exploited ones. And not to bring John Dewey or anything, but instrumentalism, experimentalism, trial and error, these are hallmarks of what makes capitalism work. It's the best system out there for error correction that we get created.
I can rebut, but it's not direct. I'll rebut. Okay, thanks. He's just doing that because he's in one of my classes.
Yes, too.
Oh, okay.
You're exploiting.
I had to balance it
That's
out.
fair. All right. I want to go back to the definition of capitalism, right? I would suggest that my understanding of there are a whole bunch of things about capitalism, but one is, there's a difference between modern capitalism and traditional capitalism. Right? I mean, capitalistic activities of an open marketplace and competition that regulates prices, right, has been around forever, right? If you were 2,000 years ago in Rome, a farmer, you would sell your grapes in the Roman Forum, right, for the highest price you can get, right? The market was there, right? So it's not a question of markets per se that defines capitalism, right? What defines capitalism is partly the notion of capital itself, right? This mystical thing that's running the show, not people, right? And the philosophy that underlies capitalism in the modern world, and that has to do with the market being the best allocator of value. Right? And if we want to talk about the legitimacy of capitalism, I think we should start there. And I don't think that definition, right, the market is the best allocator of value, addresses human concerns. It turns people into things.
I'll move on to a question designated for the Marxists, just because it kind of has to be answered, since everybody in the room has been thinking it. Would Marx's original vision for capitalism, communism, work in the United States, given that it's not Leninism, not Titoism, not Stalinism, but what you believe to be his vision of Marxism? And you can rebuttal as I close.
Well, first of all, I'd like to attack the question itself, kind of. Marx's original vision constitutes that the working class and people as a whole are collective society. So I don't think that the United States is inherently exceptional in any way, although there are different circumstances that work for different groups of people. But yeah, socialism attempts to unite all workers of the world because they all share one thing, and that is that they've had the fruits of their labor exploited by the capitalist system. To really answer your question, it depends on how you interpret Marx's original vision. Obviously, people have been doing that since he's written everything. He died before he could actually lay out a plan for what a truly communist society would look like. Friedrich Engels attempted to do that. Regardless, there are solutions within the realm of a materialist vision of society that work. I won't get into those just yet, but would you like to add?
Well, I could add a lot, so I'll stop.
Okay, I'll take it. No, just because the question itself, there's a lot of controversy, I'm sure, among Marxists what Marx's original vision was. So I asked some university Marxists. They basically said it would be the earliest famous one, which is the Communist Manifesto that we're more familiar with, where he laid out more specific plans to actually, overcome the evil exploitation of capitalism. We actually have a few of his planks of the Communist Manifesto in our country today, such as the Federal Reserve, which is a centralized bank. We have a heavily progressive income tax. Other than that, I mean, do I really want the government to take over land and property and communication? Absolutely not. I don't think any of us would have wanted George Bush or Barack Obama in charge of all of our property. Maybe some of us did. But I mean, other than that, you don't really have any specific plan laid out by Marx as to what his original communist vision would have been.
Yeah, I mean, to be succinct, I agree. I don't think his vision, whatever it was or would have been, had he lived to be however long he would have needed to have lived to have fully formulated his plan, could have worked in the U.S. But I don't think that says anything special about the U.S. I'm not sure that we can point anywhere and say with confidence that it would function. I think there's fundamental flaws with it that would prevent it from working under any theory of human nature that's empirically viable.
Okay, rebuttal. We're talking about Marx's vision. I would say a couple of things, right? Say a bunch of things, right? You're quoting from the manifesto some of the bullet points about what should happen, right? This is during the point of the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? The nasty little state where the working class takes over the state, right? The stuff that was noted in that little list of bullet points of the manifesto, and other comments also were about Marx's vision for this dictatorship of the proletariat, right? Now, I'm not in favor of the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? But I'm also not in favor of the state, and neither was Marx. Marx did not envision a totalitarian state, whether it's he says the state's going to wither away in the manifesto, right? And so the idea that Marx had this vision of having this totalitarian state and that he welcomed it is just not right, right? He thought the state was going to wither away, right? Because by the nature of the dialectics, the nature of private property being eradicated, class conflict being eradicated, et cetera, right? There's going to be no reason for the state to exist. Now, what does he mean by the eradication of the state? Is he an anarchist? Well, he had these long debates with Bakunin and other anarchists of the time, right? And I interpret his debates with the anarchists not in disagreeing with their end goal of the elimination of the state, but in terms of how we get there, right? And I would disagree with him. Bakunin, the famous anarchist that he engaged in one of these debates, said that, Marx, you're crazy. You let the proletariat become a dictatorship, they're not going to let go of their power. And of course, that's what happened, right? Does that mean that Marx was wrong? On this point, perhaps. Does that mean his theory was wrong? Come on, what theory is 110% correct, right? And then you talk about the future vision of the society. Well, I ask you, when democracy was first, in the modern sense, was first debated and thought about, did these guys have a model of exactly how the society was going to work, or did they have conceptions of values and elements of notions of justice and the like that's guiding their work? So the idea of phrasing it in the way that you phrased it, I'm not quite comfortable with, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously he wasn't in favor of a totalitarian state, as I know you guys are not either. However, when he threw out that idea that we should have this dictatorship of the proletariat and then just expect them to give up their power, I mean, it was ridiculous, I think rather naive, and then just to say, he just wasn't 110% right, I mean, that idea unfortunately resulted in the death of hundreds of millions of people. I know you guys don't support that in the least, and I generally wasn't going to bring it up, but I mean, he was wrong about that, and that was a big wrong, a very big wrong right there. So, I mean, he really had no plan for his ideas, and aside from many of his critiques of capitalism being dead wrong, like we talked about the wages and the exploitative system, his solution was non-existent except in this Communist Manifesto, which obviously went horribly wrong.
Yeah, I kind of more theoretically or big picture-wise, I also throw out, I mean, I think it's entirely right not to hold Marx to some standard of being 110% right, 90% right, 100% correct, but I think that's an argument tacitly to the advantage of capitalism because it's better equipped and better positioned to deal with its own fallibility, and it's more reactive, more spontaneous, better able to adjust on the fly. It doesn't rely as much on litmus tests or propositions that must be sworn to as if they are, holy creed. So I think that's an argument in favor of capitalism.
I'm going to move on. I will gauge the audience for any questions. Here.
Yeah, my name is Jeffrey Purcell. I'm a junior, Westchester, political science major. I have a question for both parties. specifically first for the Marxist side, and then capitalist side can rebuttal. How would you respond to like von Bauer's critique of the labor theory of value and where prices truly come from, and like the leading to the so-called marginalist revolution?
Could you explain, he's the Austrian economist, Jürgen von Bauer? Is that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say Austrian, but I mean, he's kind of pre-Austrian, but yeah.
Could you elaborate on it?
Yeah, like the labor theory of value, I would say
No,
that
I
you're
mean his critique of
the marginalist, the idea that prices come from utility, from
yeah.
marginal utility.
I know a little bit about that here. I'll just yeah, no, we get basically what it is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. Marginal utility theory, that's what you're. Basically, value is added or subtracted by each purchase of each unit of a good or service, which leads to the conclusion that people rationally, the market rationally works in people's favor because demand is basically controlled by people's wants and needs, correct?
Yeah.
Marx actually, he applied social theory to value, but he also more so added objective theories to that value. He derived that value comes from the amount of labor put into the commodity, and you branch off of that. If I can find where I wrote this. What else do I have here? Do you have anything? Yeah.
I have the way I look at Marx is that he's much more valued in terms of the philosopher as a philosopher than an economist. Right? That is, Marx identifies the problem of one of the problems of capitalism is turning quality into quantity, turning human beings into things that can be exchanged in the marketplace, turning human labor into something that can be exchanged in the marketplace, right? Now, I'm not talking about the economics here, I'm talking about the philosophical theory, right? And the idea of turning something that is fundamentally a human enterprise, right? And Marx would say, fundamentally by nature, something about human nature, as an essential part of ourselves, that we externalize, right, ourselves as human beings, right, through our labor. At least that's what we're supposed to do. But capitalism prevents that from happening, right? So that's on a philosophical level, right? In terms of the economics, I'm not going to defend Marx's economic analysis, Das Kapital. I'm more, if you will, sympathetic to his earlier writings.
I'd also like to add that when you add objective value to marginal utility, it's kind of a circular theory because it's not really subjective anymore. A person's happiness or pleasure is not entirely quantifiable. And the capitalist market kind of interferes with subjective values when you get the constant advertising and products just constantly pushed down your throat, and you have the media, you either subscribe to Fox News or MSNBC, and then you're subscribing to those two viewpoints because those are the two dominant viewpoints that really keep the system moving and the ball rolling. So, I mean, there are definitely flaws to the theory itself, although it is applicable to human nature.
Okay, so this is one of those questions that can get really technical and confusing. Basically, the labor theory of value is something Marx thought of that said the labor you put into a good is what it's worth. This is, of course, not true. Basically, no modern economist would accept this. For example, I could spend hours on a painting and it would basically be worth nothing. Maybe, I don't know, I should try that. But that might be good. Yeah, so our opponents here were absolutely right. Marx wasn't an economist. He was a philosopher, and I think there's a lot to be said about a system that might put profit ahead of people. But I think it's also very important to look at the actual results instead of the intentions. You know, a lot of people may say they want to put people ahead of profit, and that, you know, you hear this a lot with healthcare debate or reasons for welfare and stuff like that. The problem is, though, a lot of times the intentions of people that want to do good turn out horribly wrong. We can see this with something like Obamacare. This has become a disaster. You know, the welfare system of Lyndon B. Johnson was supposed to lift millions out of poverty. It actually stagnated the decline of poverty, and it's been stagnated ever since. So yeah, you can say capitalism looks at profits before people, and you can, we've heard that time and time again, but the truth is, that system that we've had globally since, you know, about the late 18th century or so, has lifted millions out of poverty.
Rebuttal person.
Yeah, I mean, we all used to be in poverty, everyone. I mean, there were, even kings and queens lived worse than middle-class people in America do today. There were no candlelight vigils for poverty in the 1600s, because people had to work on the farm. Everyone was poor.
You're all trapped in the idiocy of rural life, right?
Exactly. That was what real life was. You just grew up poor, you died poor. We didn't even dream that people could live with the kind of wealth we have today.
I'm gonna, did you have
Well, I'll try to put it on T for you, because I have a question, if I'm allowed to, or do I have to route it through you? Or?
Oh, you have a question from the other side?
Well, I mean, in the spirit of...
Oh, okay.
Would it be cheap to suggest, I mean, I'm curious to hear more about Marx as a philosopher compared to Marx as an economist, because I think, as we all know, Marx himself took a very dim view of philosophy of philosophers. And so, are we having to redefine our terms here at all? Or, you know, I'm just honestly curious to hear how this will unfold.
I would go back to this whole idea of, well, there are so many things to say. I mean, about, you know, this idea that capitalism is so successful because of America. You know, capitalism is so successful in America because of state intervention. Let's be clear about this, right? Throughout the 20th century, the state sector has grown and grown and grown, while the economy has grown and grown and grown. The problem, of course, has come in capitalism in the last 30 years, when people tried to reduce the size of the state, right? Again, I remind you that we're at a public university, right? The idea that we have a capitalist society, you know, this pure capitalist society is a myth. It's a fantasy, right? It's a state capitalism, right? And so you know, you can't play both sides of the fence, right? And so this is a state capitalist society. Let's be real with this, right? And if you want to argue that we should eliminate the state sector, then I would say that's a crazier fantasy than embracing Marx's Utopia, right? It would last 2 weeks. It would fall apart like that, right? Yeah, and then you talk about the state, you know, the capitalism being so effective. It's not simply the state interventions, but it has to do with value, right? The idea of the market being the arbitrator of value is the essence of capitalism, right? Modern capitalism, as we know it, and that's the theme that's picked up. What is the value of a human heart, right? You know, the market can't, in any kind of human way, right, allocate value indiscriminately. It can allocate value perhaps effectively when you talk about clothespins or bicycles, right? When you talk about human beings, the market fails. In the 20th century, one of the factors and one of the explanations for the success of capitalism, as you defined it, has to do with the non-capitalist sectors, not simply the state, but other sectors that accommodate value, like the professions. The healthcare sector, you know, the United States improved tremendously in terms of health. If you look at health statistics in the 20th century, up until recently, right? Longevity, childbirth rates, everything else. When the healthcare sector was not marketized, as Obamacare actually has been doing, right? It's the idea of values being allocated through a professional network. You know, the American Medical Association and various professional associations emerged in capitalism. There's no question that capitalism, as we know it, state capitalism, has been a very adaptive system, right? But that's different than saying capitalism is an effective system.
Okay, well, as we said in our opening statements, we're not defending completely laissez-faire or anarcho-capitalism. We do believe the state has a role in protecting property rights. However, I would have to completely disagree when you say that the wealth we've gotten has come from the state in this capitalist system. I mean, wages were rising substantially in the late 1800s, early 1900s, even when there were the highest union membership we've ever had in this country has only been about 1/3 of workers. And yet, at the time when union membership was the highest, these wages were not rising at their highest rate, surprisingly enough. Not at all, actually. Wages rose, conditions rose, actually without government intervention. You know, factory accidents were declining steadily, even without government intervention in the marketplace. So really, capitalism, either with the help of the state or in spite of the state, it's produced tremendous wealth. And I would also disagree that we've had some sort of dismantling of like the welfare state in the last 30 years or so. I mean, we have a $17 trillion debt that continues to grow. Welfare spending has continued to grow as a percentage of GDP. Just because Reagan, you know, cut the rate of growth when he was president, I don't think that's a dismantling of the welfare state by any means.
So you're
Okay. I'm not sure allocating value and arbitrating value